My name is Dr. Patrick Arbore, and I am the founder and director of the Center for Elderly Suicide Prevention and Grief-Related Services, which is a program of Institute on Aging in San Francisco. And I welcome you to our discussion today on bullying behavior and its relationship to loneliness. And when we hear the word bully, I think what most people automatically think about are playgrounds, grammar schools or high school. And so we think of children and adolescents, but it's also a very real problem in the older adult population. And yet I would imagine that many of you who are listening or watching this may not have had any awareness that this is a growing problem within the elderly. And so what is bullying behavior? Well, it's a conscious, willful, and deliberate hostile act intended to harm and induce fear through the threat of further aggression and create terror. And I think the key there, which I've seen for many, many years in my career, is that the person who is doing bullying is conscious. They are aware that they are doing something. And bullying, according to the American Psychological Association, is a form of aggressive behavior in which someone intentionally and repeatedly causes another person injury or discomfort. Bullying can take the form of physical contact, words, or more subtle actions, but it's a very aggressive behavior. The bullied individual typically has trouble defending him or herself, and they don't do anything to cause the bullying, to occur. And so they're often very distressed and worried that did I do something to this individual to cause them to treat me in such an aggressive way. And so that's a problem. In terms of how big of a problem this is, it's quite difficult because there aren't enough people who are doing research on this, and it doesn't mean that bullying doesn't happen among older people. It's just that we don't have enough people that are interested in doing research on this topic. Dr. Boniface is one of the few people that is actually really trying to gather data so that we can start to get a sense and wrap our heads around what is really going on in terms of bullying among older adults. What she estimates is that between 10 to 20% of older adults experience some type of senior-to-senior aggression, which usually takes the form of verbal abuse. And she goes on to say that it's tough to tease out precise numbers because these acts often go unreported. And that's one of the big barriers to this whole problem. And it's something that we've got to figure out because, for example, I was involved in this situation in a rehab facility where a woman was there because she had knee replacements, and the way they managed the lunch and dinner and breakfast situation is that they had people come to a very, very small kind of a dining room. And now these are people, because of rehab, they have walkers and canes. And one of the big issues in terms of where bullying happens is often in these confined spaces where we have too many people in a very crowded room. And so they were sitting four at a table, and this one with the knees, had the knees replaced, was aware that there was a woman who came in to sit there, and there was two other women. And the one woman was very frail, had some serious heart surgery, and was a little disheveled because of her surgery and the anesthesia and trying to recover from that. And she had said to me that one of the women at the table started to criticize this woman who was rather frail and saying to her, can't you clean up? Can't you comb that hair? Look what you're wearing. You look disgusting. and I just can't stand to have you sitting at this table and being as disgusting as you were. And the woman with the knee surgery was like really surprised and tried to intervene, but the person who was doing this bullying behavior was just nonstop. And so this woman that looked rather frail started crying and managed to get herself up, and she went back to her room. And so the other woman had said to the person who was doing the bullying, hey, you know, what's going on? And, you know, why would you do that? And the person doing the bullying told her just to shut up. And so she decided to say something to the nursing staff, and this was a quote. The nurses said to her, oh, when this happens, it happens all the time. We just let the girls work it out. Now, there's a lot wrong with that sentence, and not the least of which is, we'll let the girls, you know, work it out, when they were really not paying attention to what the depth of this is about. And the woman that was very frail stopped coming to the dining room, and yet she needed to do walking. She needed to have this kind of socialization, but she was afraid. And finally, the woman who was concerned about this talked to a social worker and said to the social worker, she said, if something isn't done about this, I'm going to call the ombudsman. So that was really a good thing. And the social worker said, let's try to figure it out. And they did. They moved the person who did the bullying behavior to a separate table, but moved the woman that I was referring to who was concerned with her, because they said she needs somebody who is strong, who's not going to be bullied. And so this woman said, hey, I'm fine with that. And so they put some other people together. But I think that this happens across the country, where staff of these facilities, senior centers, whatever, really don't understand what's happening. And then they just don't report it, they don't talk about it, they just say, let those older people work it out. And that's not going to happen. You know, in some studies, what we see is that the problem for many adults, older adults who participate in senior center activities or live in senior buildings, retirement homes, rehab centers, they may isolate themselves due to experience being bullied by other older adults. And that was clearly what was happening in the situation I just described to you. And previous research has shown that approximately 1 out of 5 residents of an assisted living facility were aggressive towards another resident in their community. Individuals who experienced relational aggression also suffered from anxiety, depression, lower satisfaction with life, and social loneliness. And so what we want to see is that, you know, with bullying behavior, particularly in terms of the victim of bullying, is that they then retreat and they slip into social isolation. Another example was I was giving a talk at a senior building on bullying behavior, and you know, there were about 5 women who had come to the talk, and I could see out of the corner of my eye there was a woman who was looking in, the door had a window on it, and I could see her kind of looking in there. And so at one point I went and opened the door and I said, oh, would you like to come in? And she said, could I just look and see who's there? Because if the person who is bullying me is here, I won't come in. And that person wasn't there, and she came in and she said, I had just moved into this facility as a result of being in another residence where I had been bullied, and she said it was really terrible. But again, just looking at this lady, she was also very frail looking, you know. And the research talks about this, which is, you know, that there's something about when it comes to older adults who bully, is that they don't want that frail person around them. They want them out, you know, because you can see and almost kind of experience, you know, their projection, you know, that they don't want to be like them. And so they really have this aggressive tone with these individuals. And so this woman was saying, now I moved into this facility. She said, my family was very concerned about me being bullied because I wouldn't leave my, my unit in this other facility. And she said, I've been here a week and I'm being bullied again. And she said, and she started to cry, and she said, and now I can't tell my family that I'm being bullied again and have to go through all that trying to find a new facility. And so she said, I'm trapped, and I don't know what to do. And of course, one of the other ladies said, well, did you talk to management? And she said, I did, and this is what management said to her: you just have to work it out. And it was just so disheartening. But again, the message is that staff doesn't seem to want to get involved in terms of trying to really find a way to deal with not only the person who is being victim, but also the bully, because we really have two victims here. We have the person doing the bullying behavior, and we have the person who is the target of the bully. The little research that we have found about older adults and bullying, at least it's a beginning. It's the beginning of building some literature so that we can see, are there best practices? We've got to find a way to approach this. Researchers have found that individuals who use assistive devices or health aids like walkers, canes, oxygen tanks, or have a personal caregiver may be a victim of relational aggression in the senior living communities. And again, the theory behind this is ageism, that they can't tolerate somebody who appears frail, appears older, and that's a problem. And so some older adults in assisted living facilities are decreasing the use of personal caregivers and assistive devices due to stigma and fear of being judged. And older adults who reported being victims of relational aggressions stated that they have lower life satisfaction, loneliness, depression, and anxiety. And again, that loneliness, that feeling of isolation is not healthy for these individuals who are being victimized, but they feel there is no hope. They're demoralized. They have to watch if there's an elevator in the building. They have to watch when they open their door to see if the bully is coming down the hallway, and then they won't go anywhere. It's very stunning. That just my own experience, anecdotally with older people who are being bullied, and also talking to bullies. It's just a remarkable thing. So examples of bullying behavior include verbal bullying, which is usually name-calling, teasing, taunts, threats, sarcasm, jokes targeting specific individuals. It's also physical, pushing, hitting, tripping, destroying property or stealing, antisocial, shunning, excluding, which is one of the ones that I see most often, gossiping, spreading rumors and using negative nonverbal body language, rolling your eyes or mimicking somebody, making gestures. So those are things that we want to be aware of. And it's not just letting these older adults, it's expecting them to resolve this because the person who is bullying is really in the dominant position. And the person who is being victimized is really feeling like they just don't have the skills or the temperament to find a way to intervene with this individual. When it comes to gender, what we see with the little research that we have is that men and women are equally likely to be the victim and equally likely to be the aggressor. So there isn't real gender differences. Women tend toward passive-aggressive behavior like whispering or gossiping. I view gossiping as verbal abuse because the person who is being gossiped about really feels violated and very upset about that. And then these kind of behaviors when somebody walks into the room and people are obviously talking about them, very painful. And men tend to be more direct in terms of their behavior. They can be more in your face with negative comments or negative behaviors. One of the things that I had witnessed in a dining room, a director of a senior center had asked me if I would sit in and just kind of watch what happens at the lunchroom where the older people come in for the day and have lunch and then go home. And again, the first thing I noticed was the room was too small for so many people. And immediately I saw people staking out claims, even though there was a big sign that says, nobody reserves any tables. And yet I saw them saying, you can't sit here because this is for my friends. And it was so intriguing. And one woman had picked up her lunch, and she was frail, and she was trying to get to a table. She saw a seat, and she was heading there. And there was a man sitting near her, and as she walked by him, he stuck out his foot, and she started to fall. And of course, her tray fell on the floor, and then she fell back, and fortunately, she grabbed the table that was behind her, and somebody helped her. Because if she would have fallen, she might have broken a hip or a wrist. I mean, it could have been really a disaster for her. And so she got back up, and staff came over, but they didn't see it. So I walked over to that gentleman, and I said to him, I was watching what happened. And he looked at me, then looked away. And I said, I'm really wondering why you put your foot out to trip her. He said, I didn't do that. But he wouldn't look at me. And I said, well, I was sitting right there. I saw you. And I said, I'm not mad at you. I'm just really wondering if you know exactly what might have happened here. And he said, I did nothing. And I pursued it a little bit, and I said, I think we really should talk about this. And he said, I hate her. I never want to be her. She's old, and she shouldn't be here. And I could just feel this ageism that had been internalized in him, that just the fact that she was so frail really made him very angry. And so it's something, again, I think we have to pay more attention to for him too, that he is so enraged by frail older people. So how does somebody become a bully? Well, we know in terms of women that when you think about girls in high school that might have tormented you, and I would imagine people listening or watching this are going to be kind of whisked back into their teenage years or young adult years where they might have been bullied by somebody. But you might have never thought about them after graduation from high school or college. And yet, what happens to these individuals? Well, mean girls grow up to be mean women. Make no mistake about it. And that was a quote by an anonymous caller to a radio talk show. Bullies have learned to be bullies because someone has taught them. And so they just don't go away. But we tend, again, to think, oh no, bullies are really younger people. But they grow up and they become better at it. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. So they've been practicing a long time. What we also have to help staff and family members and others discern is what is difficult behavior and what is bullying behavior. And so a difficult person might view reality differently than what we do. They might make untrue accusations. We know that with in-home supportive services folks, that the older person for whom they're caring might say to a supervisor, well, ever since this caregiver was there, I can't find my watch, and I think they took my watch. And then they get very angry, and they don't want to have that caregiver anymore. And so the caregiver, may or may not come back, and then they find the watch and realize they had misplaced it. And so they make untrue accusations, but they might not necessarily be bullies. They blame you for things that aren't your fault. They might criticize you, put you in a no-win situation, or deny their effects of their own behavior on other people, but they might not necessarily be doing bullying behavior. But a person who bullies, some of the distinguishing features of them are they like to dominate other people. They like to use other people to get what they want. They find it hard to see a situation from the other person's perspective, so they tend not to be skilled in terms of empathy. And they're concerned with their own wants and their own pleasures and not the needs or rights or feelings of other people. They tend to hurt others, but they tend to do this in a way that happens when authority figures are not present. So if you're living in a residence and there's a common area where the TV might be, and people, again, as social creatures, we want to socialize with other people, but on the weekends they might have fewer staff, and then somebody controls the remote. And people have said to me that they were watching a show and they were sitting there enjoying it, and the person who bullies comes in, grabs the remote, and puts it on what channel they want, and there's no negotiation. And a lot of older people, particularly in these common areas, who have been targets of bullies, are really frightened. As that example I gave you earlier, I hear this so many times that they are afraid to go, nobody listens to them, and they just feel hopeless. There's nothing that they can do. So bullies will see people that appear weaker really as prey. Bullying is also known as relational aggression or predatory aggression. They tend to kind of psychologically, the bully projects their own inadequacies on that of this weaker person in their perspective, and they refuse to accept responsibility for their actions. And another characteristic that is so important is that they lack the capacity for insight. They lack the ability to consider the short-term, long-term, or possible unintended consequences of their current behavior, and they crave attention. And so one of the things that older bullies do, they want to ingratiate themselves, particularly with maybe the director of the facility or board members. They want to have, if there is any kind of a resident council, they want to be the chairperson of that council. And it makes it really then tough because they play such a prominent role. So when a staff member says, as I did to that gentleman, I did see what you did, what they'll do is pull rank, and they'll say things like, I would never have done anything like that because look, I'm so involved with the facility and I'm really caring about everybody. So it's difficult to really recognize them, but these are some of the characteristics. So where does bullying happen? Well, as I said, particularly at congregate meal settings, bingo games. Again, I was giving a talk in a senior center in San Francisco, and I had been invited to talk about bullying behavior, and it was a small center, but the room in which I was giving this talk, again, was too small for the number of people. So people were just really squished in there. And as I was giving the talk and it was going on, and I could just feel for them because they looked uncomfortable. And then when I was talking about characteristics of bullies, and when I got to this slide in terms of, where does bullying happen, this woman raised her hand and she said, it happens right here in this room, and the bullies are here. Well, as a speaker, one had to figure out what one was going to do with that information at that time, which was not exactly easy. But I said, this is what we have to look at. And I, again, tried to emphasize that the person who bullies is not exactly a happy person. And we need to really think about this and look at what we can do to change. So other places where bullying happens are at community events such as holiday parties and that sort of thing. Any setting where there is limited space, fewer seats, inadequate resources, we have to look at the environment in these settings where older people gather. We have to look at that if we're going to, kind of put a dent into the bullying behavior, because we kind of contribute to that when we don't have spaces that are accommodating to people that have, again, walkers or whatever. Cliquish behavior among a group of residents will, as I said earlier, lay claim to certain territories, particularly at meal times, certain tables or areas of the room. And so what gets in the way? Again, I mentioned a couple barriers in these vignettes to reporting this behavior. But first of all, the person who is being victimized or targeted often feels too ashamed, and they fear retaliation. And so when I talk to these individuals who have been bullied, and I say, well, let's look at things that we could do, they often say, I'm not going to do anything because I'm so terrified of what's going to happen. Another example is that in a dining room setting, there's a woman, 97, and she was the person who does the bullying behavior, and she has her table, and she only has certain people at that table. And somebody who had been out ill had come back that day and came back to his apartment in the building, and he walked in and went up to her and said hello. Well, another woman who was, she was 97, this woman was 85, and she was a friend of that gentleman, and so she got up and walked over to him and said, oh, I'm just so glad you're here and that you've returned. We've been worried about you. And the 97-year-old woman got up from her place, walked over, and pushed her out of the way and said, we didn't ask you to come over here. And so she fell down, the 85-year-old, and was just like bewildered about what was happening. And when she was relating this story to me, she said she saw two staff people and they turned away and walked out of the room. And again, that says that I don't think those staff people are bad. I think they just don't know what to do. And so this 85-year-old woman now does not come out of her room. She won't go down to the meals and sit in the dining room. She has her meals upstairs. And she said, my life is ruined. She said, I just hope I outlive her. And I'm sitting there thinking, 97-year-old woman is acting jealous of this gentleman who, they weren't romantic. He's just another resident there. And but see, I think that we have to see that, there are some problems here in these settings, and we've got to start addressing them, before somebody gets really hurt. And people have gotten very hurt emotionally. So I really believe that staff really needs training. Staff members may, be unsure of the protocol or would prefer the situation to resolve itself. That's what I see. Or it gets written as an incident and it winds up in some ledger, but there's no, nobody takes responsibility for it. So training of staff, I think, is a real crucial aspect in terms of trying to prevent bullying. And so what do we see in this continuum? Well, that if we have an environment which is fostering disrespect, where residents know that certain people have control and power, that there's not equity among the residents, and there is a lack of civility in the situation, that can then move into a situation that is a space now where bullying can happen, and then bullying can lead into violence or elder abuse. And so what we have to be concerned about is trying to block the kind of movement from disrespect to bullying and then to violence. So what we want to think about is, what is incivility? And it's something that, again, I see when I go to these residences, that it appears that we accept that. It seems like it's the new norm in our society. And so the fundamental ethical values such as respect or fairness, honesty, personal responsibility, an acceptance of differences among people seems to be replaced by rudeness, discourtesy, insulting behavior, and at times outright bullying and aggression. And what I try to say to directors of these centers is that, we've got to find a way to regain a sense of appropriate behavior regardless of the facility in which older people gather. And the impact of the bullying behavior on the person who's being bullied is really big, it's paramount. It can have cognitive, psychological, physical, and behavioral consequences. So cognitively, what I've heard older people say to me who've been bullied is that I think everybody in this facility hates me, because the other thing that we have to watch for with the person who bullies is that they generally have other people around them who are acting in the role as lieutenants in a way, bystanders. And they will also say rude or nasty things to somebody that the bully has targeted. And that leads to that cognition that everybody hates me. Or a psychological experience or expression of, again, I feel hopeless, I feel demoralized, I'll stay in my room because I'm afraid to go out. Or a physical kind of expression, which is I'm afraid that somebody will push me and I'm going to fall, and what if I break a hip? Or behavioral, I can't go to the senior center anymore. And oftentimes, that particularly in senior centers or other places where people go for the day, staff, again, just might not look and see what's happening. And then also bystanders, other residents or other people who are at the senior center, the bystanders become aware of a toxic environment in their community of fear and mistrust. Bystanders also may choose not to tell staff about a bullying incident because they fear also retaliation from the bully, and that's why many times the bystanders will support the person who's doing bullying behavior. Bystanders, again, often feel helpless and powerless, but they don't want the bully to target them. So what do we do about bullying behavior? Well, we've got to think about, what a senior center or a senior residence can do, and we need to have some kind of official policy followed by a complaint procedure as some kind of a first step in a process that everybody who comes to that center or who lives in this facility is aware of. And these official policies tend to hang on walls, or you might get when you move into this residence or come to a senior center, you might get a piece of paper that says something about policy. But if it just hangs on a wall, people habituate to that and don't even think about it anymore. So it needs to be in the hearts of the people who have a stake in the facility, so that there's a sense of community. And one of the things that we know about people who are lonely is that we really need to provide a community of safety for people so they feel like they belong. And there needs to be a shared sense in terms of this is how we do things in this facility. We are respectful, we are civil. It's okay to disagree, but we communicate, we have a dialogue about it. There needs to be a safe and caring climate in which residents, staff, and visitors treat each other with respect, caring, and compassion. So how do we prevent bullying behavior? Well, first of all, and that's one of the reasons I'm so eager to do this talk, is that first of all, we have to admit that bullying among older adults exists. And whether it's a person, a family, an institution, we have to acknowledge that this isn't just a young person's experience, which is bad enough as we know, but it also can really harm older people as well. And we also know that bullying can exist in boardrooms, in offices, dining rooms, recreation areas, hallways. It's not just confined to younger people or older people. It happens, and I'm sure there are people listening or watching that have been bullied by somebody. Administrative staff, line staff, homemaking staff, maintenance, everybody must buy into the prevention of bullying behavior. And as I said earlier, bullying behavior is learned, and we've got to figure out a way to unlearn it. And that's not an easy thing to do. So what we can do is to empower intervention. We really want to help strengthen and provide skills for all the people in our centers or in our senior buildings, so that everybody is trained in terms of what can I do. I've done a number of trainings with older people about bullying behavior and how to prevent it or how to intervene. And it's just remarkable, as I said in that senior center, people just stood up and said, the bully is right here. I was doing a focus group in order to find out what residents thought of bullying behavior. And I just happened to work with a group of men because we had a number of different groups. And so I had a group of men, although some of them were Hispanic, but they all spoke English. Some of them had English as a second language, but they understood English. And it was fascinating because they had said things like, oh, we don't have bullying here, nobody does that behavior here. And when I ended the focus group after an hour, as people were leaving, these men were leaving, they'd pull me aside and they said, that guy over there, he's a bully. And then another guy came up and said, oh, this guy who's sitting there, he's a bully. And I said, but you guys said no bullying happens here. And they said immediately, oh, no, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to be retaliated against. And so it's just fascinating how fearful people are about telling the truth about their experiences with somebody who has bullied them. So we've got to teach the older adults to talk to staff and ask for help. But to do that really takes some courage. What we found out from the focus groups is that many of the people in the focus groups, because one of the questions we asked was, have you ever been bullied when you were young? And when we looked at all the data from all the different focus groups, that was a very common theme. I was bullied at home, maybe by an older sibling or a relative. I was bullied in school. And you could just see that they had never resolved any of that. They never talked about it. They just had to deal with it. So there was a lot of ungrieved loss there. And so to say to them, well, you need to talk to somebody, it didn't work when they were little. They don't believe it's going to work now. We want to tell them to persist despite the fact that the bully exists. We want to find alternative routes for them if they're in a situation where they need to maneuver in their facility. Are there other stairways that they can take? Do they have other options for elevators so that they don't feel that they have to be confined to their room? We want to teach them how to maintain a positive attitude even in a situation where there is a bully, and then help them connect with other residents or other participants in the senior center and talk about these things so that they feel like somebody understands them. One of the other things that we want to teach people is to avoid the use of profanity. Profanity instantly intensifies any discussion or disagreement. And you probably know that yourself, that if you start swearing at somebody, things just really heat up. And any opportunity for reconciliation is out the window. Profanity cannot only be an expression of aggression, but it can intensify aggression. And we want to find other ways of communicating among ourselves without having to swear at each other, because it just really exacerbates a difficult situation. So leadership is one of the tools that we want to kind of teach people in our senior communities. And so we want to invite residents to be part of a leadership group, but we have to have the understanding, as I said earlier, that if there are people that do bullying behaviors at your center or in your facility, they're going to want those jobs. And they're going to be very, very extroverted about that. And they're going to say they're the best person for that. And what we have to do as staff or leadership in staff is to be able to say that everybody has an equal possibility of being in these positions, if there are residence councils and things like that. And what we have to do is inform residents that bullying behavior will not be tolerated. We have to be very clear about that, because people can be harmed, as just those anecdotes that I was sharing with you indicate, that people don't feel safe at the center, or they don't feel safe in their living situations. So we want to create opportunities for residents to learn how to manage their emotions in positive ways, and so that's what we want to teach the person who uses bullying behavior to get their way, is what's going on there emotionally, and have you any training in terms of emotional regulation, and it's tough. It's tough when I'm doing these trainings with older adults. If I think I'm going to cover a lot of curriculum in an hour and a half, I see that I can't possibly do there, because they want to talk, and that's good. They want to share with us what they are experiencing, and so we want to resist the temptation to punish the person who engages in bullying behavior. We don't like the behavior, but we don't want to be hostile to the person, because we're just creating another problem when we don't respond in an empathic way to that individual. They need help. They don't need rejection. And so the prevention needs to focus on are not only on children and adolescents, as I said, but we've got to focus on the needs of older people. Again, particularly people in retirement communities and senior centers is very important. So what we have to think about is we've got to figure out a way to do what is right. And one of the things that I've been very involved in is creating curriculums for staff. So, for example, when we think about, well, staff is not responding because they don't know what to do when they are confronted with somebody that's doing bullying. And so we've got to be able to meet with staff on some kind of a regular basis and help them understand, who these people are that are doing bullying behavior. What is their backstory? What's going on with them? So we need to think about issues related to trauma, which may have occurred with older people, and trauma as a child. And then what they do is that they grow up because they see the person who had been harming them was the person in the family that had the power. And so they modeled that same behavior. And so we have to look at things like, what are the mental health issues that might be, again, undiagnosed or untreated in people that do bullying behavior. And then we have to also look very carefully at the individual who has been harmed and what's going on with them as well. And then I find that the most important aspect of the training with staff people is role play, that they get to enact the role of a person who bullies, and they get to enact the role of the victim or the target of bullying behavior. And I think that can strengthen our ability to work more effectively with older people and to understand more this difficulty that bullying behavior poses. And then I think the other side of it, as I mentioned, is that we also want to be able to provide training for the older people who come to the centers or who are in these residences, and to really give them a voice, and to remind all of them who come to these trainings is that we're not here to punish people, because a lot of times the people who have been victimized want me as a trainer to punish and shame the person who is doing the bullying, and I'm not going to do that. And so one of the critical pieces of training for the older adults themselves is empathy and forgiveness. And to really find a way to work with all of them in terms of, really being able to tell the emotional truth. What's going on with them? And then for facilities themselves, we want to, if you are in a role of consulting with, senior communities, is that there has to be something visible, and we've learned this from looking at the literature about young people and bullying and what's going on in the grammar schools and high schools, is that they'll have big signs that say, end bullying, or bullying doesn't happen here. There has to be some kind of visible sign that this facility is not going to tolerate bullying behavior. And so you want to have those types of signs, or anything that indicates that this is not what we do here. And then you've got to, on a regular basis, you've got to be able to change those signs, because older people just habituate to them. It's on the wall, but they don't even notice it anymore, because there might be tons of things on the wall. So I always suggest to people in the bathrooms, have the signs in the bathrooms, and on the doors to the stall or whatever, and change them up on a regular basis, so that they're a different color or a different design, so that the message is, we want to remind people on a continuing basis that bullying is not acceptable here. And that takes some time. The other thing, if you're working with staff in these facilities, that one has to recognize that in the field of aging, attrition happens. People come and go. And so you've got to figure out a way, how do I keep training staff so that they don't look the other way, And so that's another challenge in terms of trying to stop bullying from beginning or surfacing in some of these facilities. So it's a difficult thing. But what we want to encourage with staff and also the older adults who live there or participate there is that we want people to do the right thing, and the right thing is we need to be able to talk together about these kinds of behaviors. And so I like to quote this by Martin Luther King, and he says, "Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right?" And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but one must take it because it is right. And this is what I try to encourage among older residents or participants, but also with staff, is that we've got to do something because bullying behavior hurts people. And it's going to be very difficult for one to have a quality life if you want to go to a senior center, but you're afraid that you're going to be bullied, or in the residence that you call home, that you can't even leave your apartment because you're so afraid of what's going to happen to you. So this is just an overview of bullying behavior, but also an attempt to look at the research to date, but also steps that we can take to prevent or eliminate bullying. Thank you.